I touch on a very delicate subject. In the memory of today's Ukrainians, the probably most terrifying episode of the 20th century is the one around which the memory of Ukrainians has been built, and their sense of being a people that has always been threatened, attacked, etc., and that must defend itself. The memory of Ukrainians, if one looks at their school textbooks, is that the most terrifying episode of the 20th century was the famine, the Great Famine of the early 1930s, when the Soviet power from Moscow, Stalin from Moscow, sought to impose the great reform on the peasants throughout the Soviet Union, the creation of collective ownership, thereby taking away the peasants' land, their livestock, and collectivizing everything. It encountered resistance. And where it met resistance, not only in Ukraine, but also in other areas, in Kazakhstan, for example, famine ensued. However, Ukraine was one of the great peasant countries of the Soviet Union, and where it encountered resistance, Stalin decided to crush the resistance by starving the peasants, taking away the harvests by force and leaving them to die of hunger until they accepted, also deporting them naturally. But even before the large deportations, it was precisely the confiscation of the harvests from the peasants and allowing them to starve, since they opposed the will of the power from Moscow. In the memory of Ukrainians, this issue was initially buried because during the Soviet Union, it was not to be spoken of. It was denied, and then dramatically emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine has built the narrative of the tragedy of the 20th century around this true event that is at the center of their memory, of how millions of people in Ukraine died of hunger because of Moscow. However, in the memory of Russians, if you ask them what the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is, they will say it is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The terrifying invasion of a murderous power that exterminated millions of people, deported the Jews, opened extermination camps, gassed people, burned villages, and massacred civilians, with Ukrainians being partly complicit. The Ukrainians, out of hatred for the Soviet power, partly celebrated the arrival of the Nazis, and the Nazis were able to recruit militias among the Ukrainians who collaborated in the extermination of the Jews, and so on. And this is also true. It really happened. So you understand two peoples, one of whom remembers the tragedy of the famine, while the other remembers the tragedy of the Nazi invasion. And each of the two peoples in their memory sees themselves as the attacked people, the innocent people surrounded by enemies who have suffered terrible injustices and horrors in the past. And both are right in saying these things happened. And for us, they are unforgettable. The problem is that when you believe everything ends there, that your memory is what is worth remembering, and what happened to others matters less. Either it doesn't matter at all, or we don't want to know it, and we don't know it. We know what has happened to us, and on this we establish our place in the world and our political agenda. Here, you see where they have ended up and how it has turned out. It is not over at all, but what is happening now. Until a month ago, I would have given a more trivial example in how many Italian families have children been taught to think proudly about April 25th and to attend the parade on that day, and in how many families instead have children been taught that the partisans were not exactly good people, that they stole their grandfather's cow, that they were a rabble, that it was better to stay at home, and that Mussolini wasn't so bad, you know. It's not as they say. The regime wasn't that bad after all. How many Italian families have said and still say this? And there lies the memory of each individual. In that case, it is easier for us to say that memories are not all the same, Because during the Second World War, there were those who were on the right side and those who were on the wrong side. But it's not that the memory of those who say, under fascism, things were good. The regime also did some nice things. It's not entirely false, you see. The point is that if you confuse memory with history, that is, with the overall knowledge of what happened, and you only see your own point of view, then you won't move forward. You'll remain a prisoner of your perspective. I don't know if I explained myself well, if you agree too, that our country is made this way, for example, in these matters.
No, thank you very much for this comparison, because then there is one last question. Or rather, it wasn't exactly the last one, but anyway, the one I thought was the last. It is the reflection we always make when we read things about history. History should help us to be a bit more objective and to see things from a broader perspective, in short, to take into account the more complex aspects of reality, and not just to take sides. Perhaps the problem with situations like the one we are living in is that many of us are more concerned about taking sides rather than understanding what is happening. And this is not easy for either side. The reflection is somewhat this. Today, with what is happening, it seems that humanity is incapable of learning from the usual old story of history. I don't know how we can get out of this. Knowing history has never been enough, obviously, to avoid making mistakes.
I believe that knowing history is one of the many ways a person can have a slightly more open mind, a bit more capable of understanding the complexity of reality. It has not always been this way, and there have been times when history was instead asked to mobilize people and create national unity. When writing the history of Frederick Barbarossa and the Lombard League in the 19th century, the concern was not so much about saying, let's teach people to think, but rather about creating narratives behind which Italians could feel united. It was also a noble thing, but different from what we would like to do. I feel that at least in Western countries, today, historians want to help everyone. Remember that the world is complicated, that reasons exist but must be evaluated, and that we should not march to the beat of the drum, blindly following without thinking about things. Then it is not easy. It is not easy also because we ourselves are all in a world where we have our own opinions and our own passions. Of course, however, history should serve that purpose. It is here to help us understand others, you see. This does not mean approving of them, but rather knowing that they exist. Just as when we study the past, we realize that our grandparents and great-grandparents were not like us. They did not think exactly like we do. Partly they had different ideas, and those from 1,000 years ago had even more diverse ideas. Perhaps similar to those of people who come from distant countries and who today seem so strange to us, while our ancestors from 1,000 years ago were just like that. This should not turn into a discourse like, well, then everything is the same. There are no values. The Nazis and the anti-Nazis are the same because everyone had their reasons, and everyone thought they were on the right side. This should not be the case, of course, but we should get used to thinking that human beings are not necessarily all like us, and that things that seem right to us may not have seemed right in other times. And let us not be frightened when we encounter these differences. This is what history seeks to do today.
I really thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else has any questions because I have monopolized the questions a bit. By the way, I have also somewhat overlooked it. So if the reading groups still want to intervene with something important, a question. So there is Alessandro who...
Wait for the microphone to reach him. Can he tell us something about the assassination of Lincoln? Of Lincoln's assassination. But Lincoln's assassination is actually a very specific, very explainable, and quite absurd episode in reality, in the sense that it is an individual initiative. This is the one who kills Lincoln, the President of the United States, as you know, who led the North in the war, who decided to go to war in response to the secession of the South. Because in theory, he could have also decided, okay, we'll let you go. Do as you please. Instead, Lincoln believed that his duty as President of the United States was to save the Union and prevent it from breaking apart. And in doing so, he entered a war that no one imagined would last for years and would cost so much. And at the moment the war was over, just a few days after the war ended, President Lincoln went to the theater in Washington with his wife. You know that at that time going to the theater was like going to the movies a few decades ago. Almost every evening, let's say, it was the normal evening pastime. He went to the theater, and someone entered the box, shot him in the back of the neck, and then ran away, and was then chased and killed in battle a few weeks later by the cavalry that was pursuing him. And he was a famous actor, a theater actor, named John Wilkes Booth, a very well-known actor in his time. So much so that he entered the theater without anyone asking him for a green pass because everyone knew him. It was as if it were today, I don't know, Michel Placido to say, right, well, very famous. He enters the theater and goes to kill Lincoln because this actor, this Booth, is a fanatical Southerner and is convinced that the South's defeat is entirely Lincoln's fault and that Lincoln is the South's worst enemy. So he wants to avenge the South. In fact, today, historians have always tended to say that Lincoln was a man of reconciliation. That reconciliation between the North and the South that I mentioned took us 10 or 15 years to achieve. There were 10 or 15 heavy years with the military occupation in the South and a growing resentment among the people. Today, historians have always said that Lincoln would have handled it differently. He would have been more capable of reconciling the North and the South, and perhaps even the whites and the blacks, who knows. However, given the stature of the man, it was possible, and instead he has disappeared. So in reality, Butt did something that turned out to be disastrous for the South as well. But he was convinced, acted alone, there is no conspiracy, no oddity, and it was obviously a world in which a president of the United States would go to the theater without bodyguards or tanks outside. Unlike now, when one of our powerful figures moves,